Hello. So we're here 24 hours before voters go to the polls in most places in the United States, and the election will be over within the next 36 hours. And hopefully, we'll know a result soon after that. Now, what will this result mean for American foreign policy? Now, I've said in an earlier video that I'm pretty confident that the result will be one of two possible results, either kind of a blowout win for Kamala Harris or a very historically close squeaker for Donald Trump. We're not likely to see the Harris squeaker or the Trump blowout scenario, and I've explained that at some length in an earlier video. I remain confident in that prediction, but I would not predict which candidate is more likely to win the presidency. Now, in the event of a Harris blowout, what would that mean for foreign policy? First of all, in such a scenario, it's important to remember that the Democrats are quite likely to regain control of the House of Representatives, which currently has a very, very thin Republican majority. And there's at least a toss-up, I think, chance that they could keep the Senate at its current 50-50 balance. Due to the Senate seats that are up for election this year and the particular mix thereof, I really don't think it's very likely that the Democrats would capture an outright majority in the Senate. But if they could keep it at 50-50 and Harris wins the White House, they would control the Senate just as they do now. And that's important for foreign policy in that it would give Harris significant leverage, potentially, to push through her favored version of immigration reform, which actually has some Republicans who've supported it, many Republicans actually, and with a majority in the House and a 50-50 Senate, I think she could probably push that through. It would also give her a pretty good base for enacting key legislation on industrial policy, like Biden has done with the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, if Harris decides to continue down a road that favors industrial policy. But aside from Congress, I would say it's likely that she'd be less of a foreign policy focused president than Biden has been, simply because Biden has been so foreign policy focused. It's also unlikely that Harris would be as good at playing alliance politics and multilateralism as Biden has been. Again, because whatever one thinks of the direction of Biden's policy, he's been very adept at cultivating alliances, reassuring allies, playing politics of alliances, and also, sort of broadly speaking, multilateralism and using multilateral institutions. It's unlikely Harris will be as good at that, even if she prioritizes that. So that means that she's probably less likely to be as multilateral, but it also is likely that she would change the dynamic somewhat in terms of regional areas of focus. I think she would be slightly less focused on Europe than Biden has been. Not that she wouldn't focus on Europe, just that it wouldn't be as much the centerpiece of American foreign policy as it has been over the last 4 years. I think that in the Middle East, she would take a slightly different line. I think she would probably push Israel a bit harder to come to some kind of ceasefire agreement. I think that the Israeli government would be more likely, actually, no matter who wins the election, to agree to some kind of movement towards a ceasefire after the election's over, right? Because if it's Harris, they'll see that they're less likely to get the sort of deal that they're hoping for from the United States. If it's Trump, they'll see that they're more likely to get it, and they'll push for something closer to that sooner. I think that as regards to Asia, there will be some attempt to actually follow through on Obama's non-existent pivot to Asia, as he called it, but I'm not sure what that will really mean. I think that there will be a continuing security standoff with China, but it isn't clear exactly what shape that would take or exactly what kinds of policies the U.S. would push. I think that the troubling sign potentially would be that if Harris maintains the Biden policy, she will have a harder time working with allies just because she won't be as focused on alliance politics or as adept at it. And so key relationships with countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, etc., may be harder to maintain in security terms. On economic terms, I think Harris might well continue with Biden's emphasis on sort of broad-based industrial policy. She might, though, change tack a bit. She might actually return to earlier Democratic policies of presidents like Clinton and Obama and actually push a broader free trade and globalization agenda. If she did that, that would really be a meaningful shift in U.S. economic and trade policy, and that would have particular implications both for relationships with allies in Asia and indeed for U.S.-China relations, as I've talked about in another video. If Trump wins the presidential election, remember he's going to win in a very, very close and closely contested version of that election. He'll win the squeaker, not the blowout. If he does that, it's more likely than not that the Republicans would retain control of the Senate, or would gain control of the Senate, by at least keeping it 50-50 as it is now. And if Trump controls the White House, the Republicans would control the Senate. It's possible they also pick up one or two seats there at least and gain an outright majority in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, it's certainly possible that the Democrats get it, or that the Republican majority is so thin that it's really only one or two seats, something like that, after the election, that it would be very, very difficult really to govern through the House of Representatives as the Republicans. Indeed, the Republican caucus already finds it hard to govern, in large part not just because of their thin majority, but because of the fractious nature of that caucus. There are really at least two sharply divided factions, sort of disruptive faction and a more moderate faction. And it's the disruptive faction of the Republican caucus that's actually making it hardest for the Republicans to get things done now in the House of Representatives, even more than the Democrats are. So it's unclear to me that Trump could ram through the key legislation that I think he's hoping for, either on immigration or necessarily on trade. To the extent he needs legislation on either of those to accomplish his priorities, he will probably find it difficult to get that through Congress in the scenario where he's won only this squeaker of a victory. If he looks beyond that, right? If we look sort of beyond this, he's said directly that Europe will be less of a priority. In the Middle East, there'll be a much clearer line from the U.S. administration in support of the Netanyahu government in the current conflicts in which Israel is involved, and against some of the other key players in the Middle East. In Asia, I think there would be a much clearer confrontation with China on security terms, but one that actively eschews working with allies. And on economic terms, Trump is talking about across-the-board tariffs and higher tariffs applied to certain countries, including China. So I think we would see kind of a restarted trade war of very large proportions in Asia that may also affect Europe and other key areas with which the U.S. has close economic relations. I think it would be difficult to maintain the U.S. position of leadership within NATO, at least in the way that it has been, or that it has existed since the creation of NATO. It would change the dynamic of that alliance, I think, quite substantially. And it's unclear what the long-term implications would be in the Middle East. So basically, a Harris administration that comes in with a strong win has a chance to accomplish key goals on immigration and potentially on economic policy if they stick with the industrial policy approach that Biden has had. It will mean less of a robust relationship with Europe, but not by much. It will mean a softer line, I think, on the Middle East and a greater emphasis on ending the conflict there rather than supporting particular allied countries. And I think on Asia, there will be more emphasis there, but it's unclear with what follow through. If Trump wins in the squeaker, he will have difficulty pushing through his key priorities legislatively. On Europe, this will be a major disruption to security and economic relationships. In the Middle East, there'll be a very clear and hard line, which may also bring about a faster end to the conflicts there, but would have unknown implications, at least from where I sit. And in Asia, there would be a very strong emphasis on confrontation with China, but not working with allies, and one that would raise the temperature quite a bit of that bilateral competition dynamic. And so I'll leave it at that. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Thank you very much.